So I will not be live tweeting while I'm talking to you because I'm not that talented, but I do encourage all of you to do so, if you want to use those hashtags. And we're also going to be putting this up on Facebook Live. So thank you for having me. Today I'm going to be talking to you about depression and suicide in residency, and the title of my talk is No Longer Suffering in Silence, Depression as an Occupational Hazard of Medical Training and What We Can Do About It. We're going to talk about the crisis of depression and suicide in medicine, and particularly in training, and why I'm not using the term burnout, why burnout is distinct. We're also going to talk about the predictable life cycle of depression in training, the systemic factors that lead to depression, and also I'm going to share with you some real cases from residents who have agreed to share their stories anonymously with us today so we can better explore these issues. Finally, I want to open it up to all of you so that we can talk about what can we do as an organization, as individuals, as different programs across the country to fight this epidemic. And I want to start by telling you a story. It was 2014. It was the end of my intern year, one of the most difficult years of my life, and I suspect for many of you, one of the most difficult years of yours. I had been very lonely and isolated. I was increasingly overwhelmed with the suffering of my patients, the people that I couldn't help, more and more worried about making a mistake and hurting someone. And I was crying most days, and even on my days off, I found it very difficult to sleep. I was separated from friends and family. I lost a family member, and I never got to say goodbye. And I reached out to friends in different programs across the country, and I heard the same thing from many of them, that they were also miserable, but that they thought it was just normal, that this was just medical training and we simply had to get through it. And I wanted to believe them, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. I thought about quitting medicine. In my dark moments, I thought about killing myself. And even though my colleagues and my program were very supportive, it took me almost a year to find effective help. But at this point, I had been seeing a therapist and a psychiatrist, and after just a few months, I started to feel like myself again when I went to visit a friend at NYU Medical School. It was a beautiful, sunny day when we started walking back to her dorm, and we were told we couldn't go inside. A young man had just jumped from the top of the building to his death. He was also an intern. And even though in my darkest moments I had dreamed of a similar escape, it took me months before I understood the lesson of that day. It could have been me. It could have been any one of us. When I began medical school, I never thought that what happened to me would happen to me. I was very excited to take care of the sick and didn't think I was going to become one of them. And when we began, one of our deans said to us, "We know which ones of you have had mental health issues, and we're keeping an eye on you." And I know he meant well, but when I heard that, I thought, thank God that's not me. Thank God no one will ever have to keep an eye on me. I didn't understand at the time, but I do now, that before medical school, most of us are healthier than our peers. But for many of my colleagues, depression and other mental health issues actually begin during medical school, such that 1 in 4 medical students is actually depressed at any one point in time, and more are depressed by the time they graduate. 11% of medical students have contemplated taking their lives in the last 12 months. and only 1 in 6 have sought any kind of help. The most common reason that they cite is fear of discrimination in the residency process or some kind of stigma within their school. I really dug into this research and I knew it well, and I was really surprised by the magnitude of this problem. And in speaking with my colleagues, I soon discovered that very few people had an understanding of how many people are affected by this very common disorder. So I had all of this in mind when I wrote a piece that I hoped would help students entering medical school and graduating from medical school called "Congrats, Med School Grad, Now It's Time to Find a Therapist." And I received a lot of beautiful responses to this piece, but one really stuck with me, and the person who sent it to me gave me permission to share with you today, from a second-year medical student. Hi, I was very encouraged by the open discussion of this problem, and thank you for this piece. However, I was also worried because what if, as a medical student, you have already begun to experience mental health issues? Does that mean you're not cut out to be a resident? Does that mean I'm already broken? Think about what she's asking me here. Am I already broken? What kind of a culture are we that we have told medical students that being sick means you can't be a doctor? That having an illness means you can't be a healer? Those of us, including myself, who have been sick, know that it has made us better, kinder, more compassionate physicians, and we need to do a better job of communicating that. Luckily, things do improve as medical school ends in the 4th year, as clinical and academic responsibilities becomes lighter, such that only 3.9% of 4th-year medical students are depressed. As you might imagine, however, things get worse in residency. We don't have a good study of what happens at every year of training, but we do have one excellent study called the Intern Health Study that followed over 700 interns during their intern year. And what they found was, as I mentioned, only 3.9% are depressed at the beginning of intern year. But by the end of intern year, 41.8% met criteria at least 1 point for moderate to severe depression. In other words, there is a 10-fold increase in the prevalence of depression in the first year of training alone. Keep in mind, this is just depression. There's good evidence that substance abuse, bipolar disorder, PTSD are all more common amongst physicians. And it's just the first year. After this, we have 2 to 6 to go. We don't have a good study of attendings in practice that is very rigorous about controlling for their privacy and also identifying attendings who may not be aware that they're depressed. But the literature that we do have suggests that around 12 to 19% of attendings self-identify as having depression at any point in time. Importantly, this is higher than the general population, and it never returns to its pre-training baseline. For those who get better, depression still has consequences for their future health. We know that depression is a risk factor for future episodes of depression, for suicide, for cardiovascular disease, and for death from all causes. So if I could just pause here and talk about what I've tried to show you. We know that medical students, when they begin training, are healthier than their peers. And then we have our first big spike in the prevalence of depression during medical school, probably peaking around the 3rd year. Then, as clinical and academic responsibilities get better, it improves in the 4th year. And then we have our biggest spike during intern year, with 41.8% experiencing moderate to severe depression. Depression continues to affect us at very high levels throughout our training, And then when training is over, it does improve, but importantly, it remains elevated compared to the general population and never returns to its pre-training baseline. I want you to think about this graph. If you were taking care of, let's say, a police officer, and this was a graph of what would happen to them in their training, and you knew this, you might say to this person as they started their training, let's be proactive. Let's make it very easy for you to access help, and let's check in regularly. But so far, we have not been able to muster that kind of compassion and common sense for one another. So let me say this clearly. Depression is an occupational hazard of practicing medicine. We know not only that the prevalence of depression is incredibly high amongst physicians, the prevalence is also increasing over time. Now, why would this be? You may have heard your supervisor say to you that they simply don't understand this. After all, they worked harder than we did, walked uphill both ways on the way to the hospital, and they simply don't understand why we, after duty hour reforms, are experiencing such high levels of mental health issues. And if you listen to their stories, they sometimes go something like this. I remember when I was working 100 hours a week in the hospital, and I woke up from a 4-hour nap, and then I went outside for a smoke break. And you may think, listening to their stories, perhaps their training experience was fundamentally different from yours, and you would be correct. But first of all, residents are probably not working fewer hours after duty hour reforms. The hours are simply shifted to comply with ACGME requirements. And I know no one in this room has done this, but residents regularly lie about how many hours they work. For instance, 71.6% of surgical residents said that they worked more than 80 hours a week and did not report it. And 60% of them said they did this almost every week. One thing that does correlate with increasing levels of depression is work compression. From 1990 to 2010, the number of hospital admissions increased by 46%. The number of residency positions in that same period increased only 13%. Meanwhile, the average length of stay for each patient fell by 1/3, and the number of diagnoses and complexity of each of those admissions also increased. We also know that documentation and administrative burdens are out of control, particularly for residents who are often used as the duct tape of a dysfunctional healthcare system. 64% of residents' time is spent documenting and coordinating care. We have only 7.7 minutes of face time with each of our patients. This is not patient-centered. This is not about our education. This is about using us as cheap labor to fill in those gaps that the hospital won't. In other words, residents are doing more tasks, they're spending more time on the computer, their patients are sicker and need more face time with their physicians, but are getting less, all while trying to keep up with a rapidly increasing field of medical knowledge. In 1980, the doubling time of all medical knowledge was 7 years. In 2010, it was 3.5 years. And in 2020, it is projected to be just 73 days. That always gets the biggest reaction. It's okay, we'll go study after this. And what's most disturbing about this is that our supervisors, those in power, could be responding to this by trying to make work conditions better. But instead, they often say that we're just not as strong, we're not as dedicated, we're not as resilient as our professional forefathers. And many of us rightly interpret this message as you are weak and your mental health issues are a reflection of that. You may be wondering why I'm not using the term burnout. Well, first of all, I have seen as a clinician who takes care of other clinicians that this is sometimes a dangerous euphemism that masks people's severe mental health issues and keeps them from seeking care. I also think that it's an imprecise term which leads to imprecise solutions, and it recasts what we know as a systemic problem as an individual one. What if instead of the word burnout, we said what we actually meant? We're emotionally exhausted, we're overworked, we're undersupported, and we are therefore experiencing high rates of depression and suicide. So how are programs responding to this epidemic, which has serious implications for our health, for our happiness, for our ability to practice medicine? I'd like to take you through some real cases from residents. The first is Jesse, a family medicine resident in his intern year. I have ADD. I had it before residency, and it's gotten worse. It's starting to affect my work. I'm having trouble staying focused and completing tasks. I know that I just need to get therapy again. An hour a week would help me so much. But my program director says we can't get therapy unless we sit down with her and explain why we need it. I believe that she means well, but I just don't want to talk to the person who has so much control over my career about my mental health issues. In many cases, program directors, chief residents, and other administrators are unintentionally putting up these kinds of barriers in a misguided attempt to help their residents. But I think we would all agree that you shouldn't have to disclose your mental health issues to your boss to get appropriate medical care. But when residents are working 80 to 100 hours a week, it is very difficult to protect their privacy. So I would say that if you are working in a program and you're not tying yourself into knots, trying to figure out how to protect residents' privacy, you're not protecting residents' privacy. Programs also continue to treat mental health issues as the exception. We know mental health issues in training are the rule, and not experiencing them is the exception, and we need to start behaving accordingly. The second case that I want to share with you is Jordan, an internal medicine resident. And she told me this story. In my second year of residency, I felt like I wanted to jump out of a window. I sat down with my program director, and I told her I was depressed. She said I wasn't, because my work hadn't suffered, and they would see signs if I were really sick. But she told me, if you really feel like you're depressed, we can walk up to the chief's office and they can write you some medication. I told her that that felt inappropriate, and she responded, "You'd be surprised how many of your colleagues are on meds." Later, a classmate killed himself about a month after finishing residency. I should have known. He had become irritable, and he used to be the life of the party. My institution just sent out an email saying he died suddenly. And I was so angry because it happened after training was over and they didn't even have to take responsibility for what they did to him. So how do trainees normally access mental health support? Let's think about these cases and what they can show us about this process. As we mentioned, when training begins, medical students are typically healthier than their peers. But through a process of trauma, sleeplessness, social isolation, and frank abuse, which we'll also discuss, many will experience depression. The vast majority of them are not going to seek any kind of care, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have serious implications for their health, for their likelihood to quit medicine or cut their hours, for their likelihood to commit suicide. What is it that we hear every time someone kills themselves in medicine? I never would have suspected. He was the last one I would have thought would do this. These are the people we should be worried about. For some of them, though, their depression will affect their work performance, and they'll come to the attention of administrators through a process of feedback, which necessarily ties their experience of mental health with the punitive process. At this point, hopefully, the administrators will recognize that the work performance issue is a mental health issue and arrange treatment. But generally, during that process, the confidentiality of the resident is violated, oftentimes because residents are forced to see someone that they work with, someone that evaluates them in some capacity or sits on the clinical competency committee. Many faculty members may think that they can do both roles, but even the appearance of a conflict of interest is enough to discourage most residents from seeking care. Afterwards, the trainee will become a supervisor and will probably never tell anyone what they experienced, or even worse, discourage others from seeking help if they found it to be a particularly stigmatizing process. The reason that I'm talking about this with you today, the reason that there has been so much discussion of this problem is the problem of physician suicide. This is a picture of Dr. Juman, who jumped off of a hospital building in Mount Sinai. And as we mentioned earlier, we lost 2 colleagues just a few weeks ago. These suicides were very public, but often when physicians kill themselves, they do it quietly. We don't know how many suicides actually happen in our profession, because when people kill themselves at home or drive off the road or overdose in a call room, it's often kept quiet. But the statistics that we do have indicate that male physicians are 1.41 times more likely to kill themselves, and female physicians are 2.27 times more likely to kill themselves than the general population. And many programs responding to these suicides and responding to these numbers have recognized that they have an epidemic, but struggle with the appropriate response. And unfortunately, instead of confidential and safe mental health support, many of them have opted for wellness programs. And one of the most disturbing trends is that the language of wellness, and particularly of resilience, can be co-opted to justify continued verbal, structural, and emotional abuse. So let me say this clearly. Suicide is an occupational hazard of practicing medicine. I want to talk about how we use resilience and how it perpetuates this culture of abuse. And I think this was best described by Jamie Riches, who wrote about how resilience was talked about in her program at St. Luke's after another resident jumped off of a building. She writes, "At noon conference, we found out that one of our fellow residents had committed suicide by jumping from the hospital housing building. This intelligent, dedicated, accomplished young physician was the 3rd internal medicine resident in our 22-square-mile city to perform this act with identical detail in just under 2 years. We were dismissed to return to our pagers. A few weeks later, a physician came to speak with them and told them about how being a resident was just like being a prisoner of war, and they had to simply charge on. He handed out pieces of paper which he called his prescription for resilience. Jamie continues. We were being told to be proud of our ability to simply charge on and get the job done. We were using the language of an abusive relationship. Now, we have mostly been talking about the unintentional harms in residency, but frank abuse also exists, and it is underreported. Our third case is Angela, an OB/GYN resident. When my baby was born, I had just done months of nights. I was sleeping 2 hours a day. I felt like a failure as a wife and a mother. My doctor diagnosed me with postpartum depression, but advised me to keep it secret because she knew my program director. We were working over 100 hours a week and told not to report it. Our attendings yelled at us every day. One resident was even thrown against the wall by an attending. He's still the head of one of our hospitals. And at our National OB Resident Conference, many residents from other programs spoke about being regularly physically abused. We even reported our program to the ACGME. They came and investigated, but nothing changed. I knew I needed therapy, but if we left work for even an hour, we owed the program a whole day. So I already owed the program weeks because of my prenatal appointments. I snuck out a few times, once a month or once every 2 months. Sometimes I would wander onto the balcony and think about jumping off. My husband had to pull me back, and he told me, "You're a mother. You have to stay here for your child." When residency ended, things got better very quickly. I take care of myself now, but I have young colleagues that come to work when they are pregnant and should be on bed rest because that culture of just showing up is so strong. For those of us who do seek mental health treatment, we're actually discriminated against in the licensing process. Many applications ask vague questions about time off, which I know discourages physicians from taking time when they're not safe to work. And in 28 states, applicants are actually asked, "Have you ever been treated for a mental health disorder?" Knowing the prevalence of these issues in our profession and their consequences, I think a better question for this application would be, have you sought treatment? If not, why not? Here's a list of resources, because you're probably going to need them. We should be worried about the people who don't get care. I want to share with you this case, which is a composite of several foreign medical graduates who have other concerns than I've raised to protect their identity. When I came to this country, I didn't know anything about the racial dynamics here. There was so much anger from my patients that I didn't understand, and it took me a long time to process it. I had a death in my family, and work was overwhelming. I sought help, but I made sure to pay cash. I didn't want there to be any records that could be traced back to me. A resident raised safety concerns, and the program director threatened his fellowship and his visa. Sometimes, though, when you share your story with people, they respond with grace. And the last case that I want to share with you today is my own. When I reached out for help, I was connected with a therapist whose office was below my program director's. I came in a few times, but I was always nervous about seeing my colleagues, so I would look around and dash out. After a while, I decided that this was not making me feel any better, so I quit going. But things continued to deteriorate for me. Finally, a psychiatrist that I worked with, that I want to personally thank, Dr. Laura Warren, saw that I was really struggling, and she gave me a list of therapists and psychiatrists in the community who would see me. I called all of them. And I finally found a therapist that I connected with. After just a few months, I started to feel a lot better. And here is the amazing part. After I got better, I came back to my program and I told them that residents needed a lot more support. And they actually listened to me. And thanks in part to my advocacy, but also the hard work of a lot of different people, Cambridge Health Alliance now has a model that I think can and should be replicated at programs across the country. We have 2 psychiatrists who strictly do not evaluate residents, who provide their personal phone numbers and emails and don't keep records, and who are available to connect residents to support within our hospital community or outside of it, depending on what the resident needs. And I want to thank my program director, Rick Pels, who also encouraged me to tell my story and to tell the story of others suffering from this. This article was published in NPR, and it was read by over 60,000 people in the first month alone. And through it, I was able to connect with dozens of people across the country. And I still get emails at least a couple of times a month from people who are looking for mental health support and who are afraid to access it. I finally understand that this is not about me. This is not about the people in this room. This is about a fight for the future of our profession. What I hope to have imparted to you today is that depression is an occupational hazard of medicine. That you and I need to fight for one another. We need to hold our institutions accountable for providing the kind of mental health support for residents that they need. We need to improve work conditions, and we need to help those in need primarily by being honest about our own struggles and vulnerabilities. And I want to share with you this quote from the Stanford Balance in Life program, which I think is really advanced. It includes a lot of different components, including regular psychological counseling sessions with residents. And they write this: "We cannot change the fact that residency training is a difficult period in the lives of physicians, but we can choose to provide residents with the support and resources to improve their physical, psychological, professional, and social well-being." Finally, I want to ask you to think about your white coat ceremony. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to take a new oath with me. Think about the pride that you felt, the things that were said. This picture represents the number of physicians that we know commit suicide every year. What if at the beginning of medical school you were shown this picture and you were told, "Welcome"? Many of you have never experienced a serious mental or physical illness. Those of you that have will be better able to relate to your patients and to counsel your colleagues when they get sick. And unfortunately, many of you will experience depression and other mental health issues for the first time in medical school and residency. This is a product of the necessarily traumatic nature of our profession, but also of our culture, which we hope you will help us change. If you do need support, we will connect you to care that is confidential and safe and effective. We will help you process the pain of losing beloved patients, of not being able to help in the ways that you wish you could, and of witnessing the suffering of the people that you care for. We will encourage you to take time off when you're sick, to spend time with your loved ones, and to be the compassionate and intelligent physicians you will have become. Now I would like to invite all of you to please repeat after me. We promise to first do no harm to each other. Thank you.
My name is Ala Najjar. I am a second-year resident at Westchester Medical, New York, Valhalla, and I am a new CIR delegate alternate. My reaction to the presentation was really touching. I felt that the presentation talked about something that we all share and care about, and speaking about it out loud make it feel more comfortable and more important to address how to work on that. I think residents have a lot to do with fighting suicide and depression. The first thing is to speak up. As a psychiatrist, I find it very interesting that we tell all our patients, when you feel like that you need help, ask for help. But we don't tell the same message to our colleagues or residents. So I think the first message is like, speak with someone that you trust in your safe space, and even with little things like feeling blue or overwhelmed or emotionally burdened. I think CIR can help by providing more mental health resources to different programs, by having more delegates and more representative, increase the awareness and the education of what's available resources already provided by CIR. Per se, they have a mental health resources over $5,000 each year. And that's something that a lot of residents doesn't know about. So knowing about these resources and educate the residents and being able to direct them to specific resources in their own areas will be very helpful.
My name is Kyle Reagans. I'm from UCLA. I thought Dr. Poorman's presentation was extremely powerful. Having the courage to share your own experience with depression and struggling with mental illness as a resident, I think really just opens doors for all of us to begin talking about these issues. I think one of the biggest problems is our silence, and that there's not the space to really have honest discussions about this. So for her to stand up there and have the courage to talk in front of a group of hundreds of doctors in training about the issues she faced, I think goes a long way in helping all of us and helping us open up that space for discussion. And the fact that she's written national news articles about it as well, you know, just shows so much courage. She said that she almost gets characterized as the famous depressed Dr. Poorman, and you know, she's joking about that, but I'm sure that's true to some extent, and I can't imagine what that's like to have to walk around and for everyone in her hospital to know, like, oh, that's the doctor who's struggled with depression. And for her to take on that so that all the rest of us can benefit it was an amazing talk. The biggest thing that residents can do is create a space to talk about it and reduce stigma around it. And to have the courage to be vulnerable, like Dr. Poorman was in her talk. I think most of us don't have that courage. A lot of us don't have the courage to have vulnerability to express our own shortcomings about even the smallest things. And that part of the culture of medicine, I think, is a lot of probably what is driving depression, that people don't feel like there's space to talk about any of their shortcomings. And so any shortcomings they feel just drives inadequacy and depression. And so the more that we can feel comfortable sharing our vulnerabilities with each other and not put up this facade that we're all perfect doctors that never make a mistake ever and always do everything they're supposed to do without fail, the more that we get rid of that facade, I think the better off we'll be, and that's probably the biggest thing that we can do as colleagues, is just making that space. One of the things that, in my opinion, would be very helpful at a hospital institutional level is when they make seeking mental health services mandatory for everyone. They're creating a new medical school run by Kaiser Permanente, the Kaiser School of Medicine in California right now, and their plan is to have every single medical student have to go to therapy, whether they have a mental health issue or not, to reduce the stigma and reduce the barriers of access. So that it's just something that's scheduled into their schedule so that everybody has the time for it because it's something that's scheduled. There's no stigma because everybody has to do it. And it makes sure that we're identifying the people that are having those issues and creating spaces for them to talk about it that's destigmatized, early on and before the issues really start to spiral out of control. So I think CIR as an institution has a lot of power. We negotiate the contracts for what is going on at these different institutions, and we help set the national agenda for what's being talked about in terms of issues how staff are facing and the medical system overall. And so the more that CIR can push arrangements like that at the institutional level and push that as a national agenda, that we should have scheduled, mandatory services in terms of psychiatry or psychological counseling services for all house staff, I think that would be the solution to the problem.